I promise that this video will not have any puns. If you've programmed in a language like Java or C#, those kinds of things, you'll be used to programming in threads to get work done that would normally block input and output. Things like contacting a database and waiting a while. If you want other stuff to happen while that's happening, you need to use threads. In Node, threads really aren't used for that. There are threads in modern Node, but much more often we'll use an event loop and we'll use callbacks, promises, and async await. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Let's start with a simple example. We have at the top a simple function that acts like a database callback. It'll just give us a result in 2 seconds. It takes a callback. We can't use the result directly. We've got a little console log here in the middle just to give us an idea of what order things are happening in and when. Then we actually call our function. And at the end we have the callback that we're actually going to pass in when we call it. So when we run this, we get our hello, and a couple of seconds later, we actually get the console log of hello Fred. So what happens when we change the order of this? Let's put this console log after we call the function. Take a moment, pause the video, make a little prediction. Let's run it. And of course, we still get the first hello and then we get hello Fred. So what happens if we want to do this multiple times? Let's get ourselves a copy of this. We can just copy and paste this. And let's change a few names just so we know which one is which. Get ourselves a few friends. Again, pause, take a moment to predict what's going to happen. We get all of the output, but they all came out at the same time. This means that we're not waiting one after the other. These are all actually executing together. So what if we wanted to actually make them wait one after the other? Instead of this console log, we'll have to actually do our call to the other say hello in 2 seconds. So we're going to have to chain these one inside the other. And this is where we start to get ourselves into what's called callback hell. This is going to have to move up to here. I can still do my original log, and then I can call the second say hello in 2 seconds. And instead of this, we'll have to replace this again. Now I can use the console log again, and I'm going to have to take this and put it up inside this nested thing. And we have to repeat this process every time I want to make another call. So I'm nesting inside nesting inside nesting. Okay, let's see what happens when we run this now. We get our original hello Fred. Now it's waiting 2 seconds for each call. And this is what we're after. Okay, great. We're in callback hell. How do we get out of it? We're going to introduce promises. We're going to need a copy of our say hello in 2 seconds up here. But we're going to do it slightly differently in that it's going to use a promise instead. We'll give it a new name so we can keep the old one up there. And it's going to operate in a similar way. It'll take a name and it will return hello name. But it still has to take 2 seconds, it still has to wait, and it still has to be asynchronous. So we're not going to be able to return that directly. No, actually, this is not quite what we need. We'll have to delete that. We'll give ourselves a new promise. And inside that, we can pass it 2 arguments, a resolve and a reject. Now, these aren't strings or numbers, they're functions. they're automatically passed into our code by the promise construct. We'll just ignore the reject for now. We just want to resolve. Resolve is what happens when things go correctly. So we want this to happen when things are going right. We need to call resolve to actually get the result back. So rather than running this callback, we'll resolve with the information instead. Now you notice the small difference here. I'm not using a callback anymore, but it is still going to have to be asynchronous. It still has to wait. That set timeout can't do anything else. It can't return a value. So let's get rid of this stuff. We'll make an equivalent using our new function. We'll just pass in Fred here. Oh yeah, we'll need to quote it. And let's actually capitalize it the same way we did. That's better. With a promise, we have this dot then we can then call. And this is how we use the result. Dot then waits for the promise to actually get rejected or resolved, and then runs the code that's inside there. That's why it's called dot then. Wait for this promise, then do what is ever in here. The argument to dot then is your own function that takes the output and then does whatever it needs to with it. We run that, we get the same result we did before. So notice we're only passing in the name now, not this callback. So we've simplified the way we call it a little bit by returning this promise instead and just resolving the promise. And since I don't call about this reject, we can actually just use an underscore here, and it just tells my IDE not to worry about it. It means we're ignoring that argument for now. You obviously wouldn't want to do this in production code. Let's move on to getting back to where we were doing multiple calls. We can chain these dot then calls, because each time we call dot then, we're actually returning another promise. This means that we can take the result from a previous dot then call, use it in the next dot then call. We just chain them together. So we don't need to get a new argument to this one. We're just going to use the new names. We're not passing anything out of our console log line there. So all I've got to do is ignore the incoming argument here again and say hello to Jill. Then I can just repeat that whole process again. I want to log the output from Jill to prove that's coming out. We'll put that in here. And then I can do this again, but we'll do it for the next name. Now that we have all of the names in here, let's go see what happens again. We get out of hello, hello Fred, and it's waiting again, 2 seconds between each call. So we've chained them like we did before. So this is all well and good. But we still have this chain of thens, and you can see that that would actually be annoying having to pass stuff. So let's look at a new solution. Now we're going to move on to async and await. So you're going to need to do things slightly differently now. To use async and await, we need to be inside an async function. So I'm going to give myself an async function called main that I can then call to actually get all the work done. And yeah, let's actually put this in the right place. That would help. There we go. So this is going to be a function, and the body of that function is where we do all of our work. So everything that we had up here, but written in a different way again. So I'll be calling say hello in 2 seconds, but I can now await that, and this is the difference. Well, you call it with Fred again, of course. But if I await it, I can actually assign this to a variable. This is something we couldn't do before. We had to either pass in a callback or chain a .then at the end of my promise. Now I can actually put the result of say hello in 2 seconds into this output variable, and I can just console log the variable as if this were synchronous code. If we run this now, of course, currently it'll only give us hello because we haven't actually called main anywhere. So we do need to do that. Let's grab main, we'll chuck it in here and call it. Notice that main itself actually returns a promise. Look at this. So we can't get away from that. We're always going to have a promise somewhere. We can run this now, we'll have hello, and then 2 seconds later we get hello Fred like we did before. But we've been able to await it and assign it to a variable. This is the difference. So if we want to get this happening multiple times, as in our previous results, we can just copy and paste a little bit and just make all these run one after the other. And these will now run one after the other. We'll actually not have to chain, but one's going to wait because we're awaiting each variable as we call it. You can see it awaits one, console logs the output, then awaits the next, console logs the output, then awaits the next, etc., etc., etc. We obviously need different output names here because we can't assign a new const every time. So we make that change. And we should be good to go. If we run this, we get hello. Then we get Fred. 2 seconds later, Jill. A couple of seconds later, Bob. And a couple of seconds later, Jenny. So that's all well and good, but what if we want to get rid of these awaits in that, well, we don't want to await one after the other. We want to get back to this very first thing we did when we had our nested callbacks. In other words, well, before we had the nested callbacks, we were actually running everything in parallel. What if we want to do that here? Well, first of all, let's go back to our promise example and show you how that works with promises, because we need to, again, start from the start. So we'll actually get rid of our main here. And we'll go back and we'll resurrect our promise example and we'll make a few changes here. First of all, let's get rid of this console log here. And in fact, let's get rid of the rest of these lines. We'll just duplicate them because I don't want to go finding these inside these functions. It's going to be easy to copy and paste again. We'll get the names back from down here. Just get those in the right places. So now I've got 4 different promises being called, and I want to really be able to do something with these promises themselves, because if I'm not doing a .then, I just have a promise that I can do something with. So I can assign these to a variable. This will be a promise that will either be resolved, rejected, or pending. It won't have actually resolved or rejected yet. Give ourselves some new numbers for these. So these are all now individual variables that hold these promises in them. Now I'm able to use these promises a little bit like I did before. I can use my .then on the variable that I've assigned them. Most importantly though, I can separate out the promises themselves from what I do with the promises. So it'll be a little bit easier to do this duplication and a little bit easier to make another change we're going to make in a moment. At this point, we can go back and run things and everything happens all at the same time. So we're back to the way we were at the start. As with any code where we repeat ourselves often, we can look for a way to simplify things a little bit. Let's get rid of this, and we'll use another technique we can use in promises, which is the promise all construct. So we'll give ourselves a variable that I'll name properly. That's better. And this is going to be the result of running all of those promises at the same time. So what we get from that is going to be an array of all of the outputs of all of the promises, because I'm passing it an array of all of the promises. So now, if I get an array of all of the outputs, I can process those outputs as an array. So let's do that. We can go .then on the result of the entire thing, because it's still a promise itself. And we'll just console log the output itself, just to show you the structure. This is going to be an object though, so I'm going to have to stringify it just to make it a little bit more obvious what's going on. Let's run this, and we'll see what we get. We get our hello, of course, and then I'm getting the stringified version of my array. Now, if I don't want to do this console log on the entire array, I want to get each individual element out again, well, I can just do that in some kind of looping structure. So replace this console log with a for each on the output. Let's do that. So if I take each individual output element, and we'll console log the individual output element, I don't have to do any more JSON stuff because I'm back to a string. We can run that, and we get the same kind of result we did before, and they're all running at the same time. As you can see, they all come out together. So we can use this same concept down here in our async await implementation. We can use a promise all there, and everything we did up here in a very similar way. All we've got to do is get rid of the awaits, and each of these outputs will become promises. Because we're no longer awaiting the result, we're assigning the promise directly into those variables, just like above. That's not going to be any different. Let's call them the same thing just to make that point. I can't console log that output anymore, it doesn't exist now. So we take these out. We'll change the rest of these back into promise variables. These are just names, it's just so that we know what's going on. And we can clean up a little bit. Now we can reach back for our promise all magic. All we have to do is give ourselves a result of running all of these promises at the same time with promise all. So we use the same format we did before. We can pass all our promises back into promise all, just like up here. So this is the same. But if we await this promise, remember what our output is from running promise all. It is an array of all of the outputs. So now outputs will actually have that array in it. And we can just do the for each, console log just like above, and we're awaiting the result. So we've done the await at the promise all, not at the individual promises. That means when we run it, we get our output all at the same time.